Hello, my name is Riqia Taylor,
Hi, I'm Sada.
and this is Poli 302 Politics of the Civil Rights Movement, and we will be presenting on the documentary Freedom Summer. So, the first question asks, what are the themes of the documentary, and what is the central thesis of the documentary?
The theme of the documentary was getting equal rights in a form of getting African Americans in Mississippi their political right to vote. The overarching theme of this documentary was the importance of African Americans and whites coming together to help make social change, the importance of student involvement in social change, and another theme or rather, a view into the world focusing on the violence and hate that was spewed by the white Southerners, not just of the African Americans from Mississippi, but also the African American volunteers and white volunteers from other states. Freedom Summer was a nonviolent effort by civil rights activists to integrate Mississippi's segregated political system during the civil rights movement. The Congress on Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee aimed at increasing black voter registration in Mississippi. The Freedom Summer workers included black Mississippians and more than 1,000 out of state, predominantly white volunteers. They also wanted to expand African American voting rights throughout the South.
The theses that we identified as a group is the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project made a long-term impact on political representation in Mississippi by conducting door-to-door voter registration, creating freedom schools to educate the community, and creating the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Question 2 asks, what are the historical and social contexts of the documentary, and how does it help you to understand the documentary?
Having learned about the civil rights movement previously, we had some insight into what went on. Throughout our textbook by Alden D. Morris, we learned about how different groups, primarily the NAACP and the SCLC, were the main ones to organize different boycotts and protests. In this documentary, the social context exposed are how educated African Americans and white college students and younger population of whites came together through different organizations to help achieve the rights for African Americans in Mississippi. The documentary focuses on how white men and women, volunteers, were staying in African American households. For the men, it seems it was slightly easier, and for the women, not so much. One of them, Linda Wetmore Halpern, talks about how she was walking outside one night and she got attacked by angry white Southerners. Another example is the Miss Mississippi, Barbara Jane Nave, and her family had a couple of volunteers over just to see who these people were and ended up having their life turned upside down. Another important aspect of this documentary was how the law was actually working against African Americans and the volunteers. The registrar was using her position to prevent African Americans from getting registered to vote. She was denying them for the smallest reasons or no reason at all. The sheriff and the policeman were all antagonizing not just the African Americans but the volunteers as well. The KKK showed up after they decided that the authorities were not doing enough. There is also the mysterious disappearance of the three men.
When white students were coming from all over the country, they had no idea what they were walking into. In fact, in one of the scenes in the documentary, we see during their training in Ohio that they were shown a movie of Theron C. Lynn. He's the Forest County, Mississippi registrar. And the white students literally began laughing at him. And this caused tension between the black students who thought these white students are going to get us killed. They are too naive. This also caused the white students to think that the black students had no hope at all in them being there. And when the three students, two white, one black, Cheney, Goodman, and Schroeder disappeared in Meridian, Mississippi, this made it utterly clear to white students that they needed to take what they were walking into seriously. Literally, their lives depended on living with and listening to the instruction of black people. This is something that they never had to do. This is important for us to understand why having students come from all over the country really gave the Freedom Summer movement the wheels it needed to get rolling. Morris presents the idea of the newcomer status. So, this is an idea that the longer that a group or a community leader has lived in an area where blacks are pushing back against their unfair treatment, they are subject to intimidation. When you look at the civil rights movement as a whole, it's post radical Reconstruction, the 14th and 13th Amendment, that opened the door for black politicians. It's post the influence of Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, and W.E.B. Du Bois. It's post the Harlem Renaissance, which highlights the freedoms of blacks through the expression of art, music, and literary pieces. We see the emergence of civil societies such as the SCLC and the NAACP, and successful litigation tactics such as Brown versus Board of Education. We see the discrimination of African Americans in the military. We see two great migration periods of blacks from the south to the north and continued poverty in black communities. All of these things fueled what we know as white resistance, which is really vital to us understanding the events that took place during Freedom Summers. All of these social and historical contexts help us create a framework that allows us to understand the Freedom Summer movement as a whole.
The creation of the NAACP, the SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, pronounced SNCC, the important role that the black churches played in the lives of African Americans, how they helped enrich the communities, how they helped to provide a safe environment for not just worship, but friendship, support, and learning. The Freedom Summer School for Children and Young Adults that was held by the volunteers to help educate young African Americans in Mississippi about African American history and literature, the importance of historically black colleges, and the safety net that they provided the African American students who wished and had the opportunity to further their knowledge.
This semester, we cover 6 components of liberal democracy. Here, I will identify 3: representative democracy, the wide sphere of privacy protected by civil liberties and civil rights, and private property/market economic society or capitalist economic society. Representative democracy is the heart of Freedom Summer. Although it had several goals that included educating the community, bringing awareness to the country about the strifes in Mississippi, and registering people to vote, all of this was done to gain fair representation in the political arena. There was a federal system in place where people could choose who would represent them, but the reality is those elected at the state level implemented laws that marginalized black voters. These laws were used as intimidation tactics that not only stopped blacks from voting, but stopped them from registering to vote with unfair literacy tests, grandfather laws, and unfair voter requirements. We learned in this course that civil freedoms are protected from arbitrary interference of other citizens. We see a wide sphere of privacy protected by civil liberties and civil rights in the documentary with the presence of the White Citizens Council. There was no heavy KKK presence at the time because you have the presence of the White Citizens Council that served as the apparatus of white supremacy society. Their job was to push back against any changes that Freedom Summer wanted to make in Mississippi. The White Citizens Council, they were not successful in Mississippi because, as we see, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was successful in electing their delegates. Even though we know the MFSP did not get the outcome that they wanted at the national level, we see that they were successful in the state of Mississippi because ultimately, at the time, Mississippi had the highest population of blacks in the country, and so whites were extremely fearful that if they could get representation, that they would lose their power. The last component that I want to acknowledge is private property slash market economic society or capitalistic economic society. As a result of registering to vote, blacks in Mississippi lost their homes, their sharecropping opportunities, and their jobs as domestic workers. The capitalistic system of power continued to gain control over blacks by hurting them, literally removing roofs from over their head, taking money from their pockets, and food off of the table.
This part's a little more personal, and this is for what I took from the documentary. The information and the ideas in this documentary helped enlarge my understanding because prior to this documentary, I hadn't known just how awful the conditions were in Mississippi, although I was aware of how awful they were in the South. After viewing this, I am under the impression that this is one of the worst Southern states during the Civil Rights Movement, and I had not been aware of the efforts that came about during the time in Mississippi, nor had I known much about Freedom Summer. I knew that there was heavy segregation, discrimination when it came to voting and registering to vote. But in the documentary, one of the interviews makes a comment about how they had people with master's degrees and PhDs and were still not able to pass the voting registration test and the literacy test because they were made to be so complicated.
This documentary helped enlarge my understanding of the importance of organizing and civil societies. As a millennial, we learn about civil rights movement as a whole with violent and nonviolent protests. And then we have our own movements such as Black Lives Matter. But this course really broke down the civil rights movement to compartments and zoomed in on how individual movements contributed to creating one large movement. This documentary did a good job of telling the story of how educated blacks and whites came together to challenge the unjust treatment of black people in its face. It displayed the raw, unapologetic, fearless attitude that both blacks and whites wore on their face as they fought against the political system.